Game loaded.
One. Hi, and welcome to this edition of Lessons Learned with your host, Rafael Piñero. Welcome once again to the Mathsquad podcast. I believe this is number 9. I'm feeling like JP, where he forgets the numbers of the podcast. Before we begin, we're recording on a Sunday, 12th of May, 2016. And there was some tragic news out of Orlando, Florida, United States. A mass shooting at a LGBT plus club. The news report that over 50 people have been killed and another 50 or so have been grievously wounded. I'm going to avoid political commentary. I'll probably just mentioning this is a form of political commentary nonetheless. But my thoughts go out to the families, friends, and of course the victims themselves. And I think the only thing I can caution is that people should take some time to absorb the news. A lot of stuff comes out in a barrage of news in the first day or so, first 24 hours. So, just pay attention to it, listen to it, feel to it, share with your family and friends, and go from there. And if you're feeling a little bit of tragedy or exhaustion, basically, we hear these news over and over again. That's also understandable. So with that, we're going to move on with the show. So always we have Scary Diem and Arthur Perkins, APR Gaming, if I said that correctly. And of course myself, Rafael Piñero, from Lessons Learned. And we're going to be talking about tactical versus strategy or strategic in role-playing games. What do I mean by that? Well, essentially, the tactical part is what I want to call the vertical integration, right? Leveling up, getting abilities, getting magical items, that sort of thing. That is something happens fairly regularly in RPGs. But what about the impact of the players and the players' actions in the setting itself when they acquire specifically political power or economic power? Because the tendency for many games is to treat the setting as being static, right? The players run around, do all the things, they kill things, they capture things, etc. But overall, there seems to be a need to, to keep things static as possible so that you can keep generating adventures and maintain the status quo. And I can see Arthur already is having some thoughts on the issue. So, Arthur, kick it off for us.
I believe the exact opposite. That most role-playing games are designed that the players specifically have a way to alter and change the ever-flowing narrative of the landscape, whether that's physically or whether that's on a societal level. And there are a number of games that completely support that. Apocalypse World is literally designed around that concept.
I'd say the big differentiation comes in between whether or not they give you good tools to do so. Like D&D sort of assumes you're doing all these things to impact the world, but there's very little in terms of tools to sort of support a lot of like narrative advancement and changes in the setting.
Maybe, but there's things you can do to spice that up. I run a kingdom building campaign for 5e where it's changed a lot from how it began. The players, usually every week, but sometimes every other week, every time 28 days passes in the campaign, will get a chance to build new buildings for their kingdom or expand their lands or various other things. And I borrowed it from Pathfinder's Kingmaker and converted it to the 5e rules. But you can definitely make 5e work for that. You can definitely make Pathfinder work for it. It's been amazing. And we got the audience involved in it. It's nuts how popular it is. I'd say almost every system I can think of offhand, you can make some pretty major changes. Mouse Guard, definitely. You can. I don't know if you can alter the nature of the race that you are, but you can definitely keep presenting yourself as being of a certain nature and convince others to follow you down that path.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I brought the theme of it, we have Balance of Power, which is running right now on Roll20 and on JP Daniels Roleplay channel, hosted, of course, by none other than Adam Coble. And actually hosted by JP and run by Adam Coble. And he's introduced, it's mostly behind the scenes. He hasn't talked too much about it outside of his Reddit, about a point system for the characters. So as they act on their different missions, they acquire points, and that gives them resources. And those points, I believe, are based on those actions. For example, if they help one faction or another, if they liberate a world or the world falls to the opposition, then they get certain points, and then they can invest those points in future missions. So that's probably one mechanic. Starts with that.
Are we talking about the duty mechanic? Or was that something he designed? I didn't catch the hack attack for Balance of Power. So
yeah, he was talking originally in the hack attack for Balance of Power discussion to it. He's only done one, so and basically most of the ideas he's presented on Reddit, and it's a separate system. It's basically you get point systems. I believe you get certain points because he's running two groups. Right. He's running your Rebel group, which is the second group, and the first group is the Imperial group. And as they go out in missions for the Empire or for Rebellion, depending on what they do and how successful they are, they can get resources in the form of points that then they can invest later on.
I'm curious why you think there haven't been effects. I'd say probably the biggest one was at the end of, was it the first or second light side, where they went to go home and the whole base was blown up, and that was because Darkseid took it out during episode 1. Right? Like, we are seeing the shadows of the effects of both campaigns on each other.
That is very true. By the way, major spoilers for Balance of Power that is running right now. You should check it out if you haven't done so already. Go to JP Daniels' channel on YouTube or to catch up on the VOD, or go to his live feed on Twitch. I believe there might be, not this week, but next week or the week after that, because of E3, they're not going to have a show, but you can always catch up on the VODs. Another game that has a similar dual mechanic is Swan Song, because the game system, start with that number, does have a system for the GM to track the factions. But I think that exemplifies sort of the division, right? That the tactical aspect exists in one area, and the strategic rules exist in another area. But unless, Arthur was saying, unless you really create some kind of connection between them, it feels like they're kind of distinct, right? Unless you have very specific narrative reasons to have introduced one change or another, they can remain separate, at least by the rule set itself. So, Scardium, do you have any thoughts on that?
A system I think has done it especially well is probably Blades in the Dark. The way they integrate all of the advancement of players and the crew advancements together really sort of makes it all come together in a very interesting way. And that's really, it's sort of made it so that there's not really as much of a distinction anymore between what is advancing your player characters and what is advancing your crew.
I think the real discussion here perhaps lies less in the system that you choose, but the people you play it with, right? Because what you're discussing, the base assumption that in a role-playing game the world doesn't change as much, is a GM side thing, right? Like, it's the GM not presenting things to the players this is how things have changed.
Yeah, although I also seen from the other side, like, remember you mentioned Pathfinder Kingmaker. Our group tried to run a that kind of campaign, and most of the players basically begged off and say, we don't want to deal with that. And I think it came up from years ago. This happened more than a decade ago. I've been playing for that long. Experience that we had with Birthright, which also had similar mechanics built in. And so I think a lot of players didn't like what happened with that and said, oh, no, we don't want to deal with the sort of strategic kingdom building kind of stuff. I try to step in But then from the GM point of view, he introduced certain things that just didn't seem to match the roles that I was making. One situation was we built a sawmill, and then in the beginning of the next session, a group of goblins or kobolds came in and destroyed it, just because, right? But the thing about it was that we were making rolls that were a couple of months at a time, so that the building of the sawmill should have taken a couple of months and should have been persistent, at least for that time. But through GM fiat, it got destroyed in an instant, right? And that kind of created that problem. It's like, okay, I'm playing the kingdom building part, but the moment I step as a player, my options are gone.
I mean, what you're describing, everything you just said, is a GM player disconnect. If people don't want to play a Kingmaker style game, then they're not going to, and that's something you just need to talk about, right? It's not necessary that you have to use the Kingmaker system to make Pathfinder less permanent and more transient, more narrative, more changing. But it is a good place to start. But if that's not something the players want to do, then you just say, something has changed since the last time you came back into the tavern. All the skulls of the champions of the goblins that you killed are hanging up there now, and people are buying you drinks at the bar. And that's a really cool way to just be like, oh, we did something last week, and now people come back and they remember it. It's like triggering flags in an MMO.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but again, in an MMO, which is a good, I call them MMGs because the online part seems to be a bit superfluous these days. Almost all games are online, at least video games anyway. The thing about it is that you still need that sort of permanent world behind it because you have so many players running around doing things. And I think, and talk about permanency, if you have too great changes, you came to the point where essentially the player characters either, for the action sort of destroy the world, right? The stakes get so high.
A lot. So yeah,
it happens a lot. Yeah, or they basically adventure themselves out of a job because the nature of being running around and going to dungeons and kicking doors or whatever it is that you do in a particular game. Of course, the apocalypse world treats it very differently, so not all systems are the same way. But eventually, it's like, oh, you're the head of a guild. What are you doing running around, pickpocketing people? You're the local duke. What are you doing, going to a dungeon, that sort of thing. And I think a lot of GMs particularly, or even groups, have a problem with transitioning the story into the higher stakes, more responsibility, and have the sort of the in-game sessions reflect those changes and back again. Not simply a matter of, skulls in the wall kind of situation.
But isn't what you just described systemless and more based off of a player to GM dynamic?
Oh, definitely.
We'll keep coming back to that one.
Yeah, but again, going with D&D and others, you have to work with the system you have, and if the system doesn't encourage you to do certain things, it means more work on the part of both the GM and the party.
Sure.
And perhaps we had systems that encouraged that growth on both sides, and especially taught beginner GMs who have these great ideas about very cinematic and stuff like that to be able to integrate that. We would have perhaps a smoother experience as well. And tying in with what we were talking about the last week, also the meta, changes outside of the meta can also change the situation, and so you have to adjust accordingly. So it can become very complicated very quickly. Okay, you know what? Well, let's pick up on Apocalypse World, because there was a section of that. Adam ran that, and he had Apocalypse has the clocks. So does Blades in the Dark. I'm not very familiar with the clocks, so I'm going to give you guys more
I
chance
ran
to
a
talk
5
about.
episode.
Yeah, and talk to me like I'm a newbie. How do I use these clocks to keep track of the changes that are happening and the intersection between the characters and the setting, because I think that's what the clocks are really all about.
Sure. Have you? I mean, I hate to describe something by describing something else, but have you played Dungeon World?
Yes.
Okay, front system. You're aware that when you set up a front, there's, if it's I think it's called a campaign front, there's a series of things that happen in line, like you find the key, the trumpet sounds, the second trumpet sounds, the door opens, the angel comes out, and each of those are performed in order. The clock is exactly like that. As sections of the clock get filled in, the objective or the goal or the person or the force gets closer to what it is they want to do, and you reflect it narratively. So if you have a 4-part clock that's just called Dremmer goes insane and stabs Tizzy to death, filling in the first part of the clock might be reflected in game by having Dremmer, eyeing Tizzy up. When you get 3/4 of the way of the clock through, Drummer might be, talking some mad smack about Tizzy and sharpening his blade in the open. And the players will get to see that progression and be like, I wonder if we should do anything. On the other hand, they might just be like, well, that's not our problem, and then Tizzy's dead. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's how the clock system works. And that's just a very general example of the kind of utility you can get out of the Apocalypse World campaign. I don't even know if I'd call it that. It's just the GM side of Apocalypse World is tied very much into how the players play.
Yeah, clocks at their core are more about how you think about narrative events in your game. It basically is training you to think about narrative events as also mechanically significant things. And it really ties together Apocalypse World in a sense, because it basically is training you to break down narrative events into concrete sort of material progression. So you'll have a 4-point clock, and each of those, it doesn't really matter what each of those sections is, but it'll train you to think about, okay, I need to remember 4 significant narrative events and track down 4 significant narrative events. And the main reason that's beneficial is because before you start thinking in terms like that, you're just sort of like, well, maybe this is good enough to sort of advance something along these lines. You have to sort of feel it out by a case-by-case basis. But this gives you a good framework for thinking about sort of any sort of progression in narrative in a way that is concrete and consistent.
Yeah, I think it also shifts. Guys have explained it to me, and I read the rules, of course, so I have some idea what the clock is all about. And also fronts in Dungeon World, because I have run at least one campaign of it, very short one. It's interesting because I think it also refocuses the idea on, instead of being, this adventure is all about, difficulty of this lock, or, these monsters are going to be this challenge or whatever. It's about what the players do and what's happening in the world and bringing them together, which I think is the crux of the conversation, right? That intersection between, hey, I go here and I mouth off to the regent, and what happens with that, because it could be that the regent just throws me into jail and that's the end of that. But if the regent sort of stands and goes like, and then I just leave, somebody in the regent's court who already has a clock going, maybe Longqing might want to launch a coup, says, I might want to talk to this guy because it's important, right? So there's something going in the world that wasn't necessarily at the beginning connected to the players, but when my narrative, my character's action intersected with that, it was like, now you're on the clock. Is that a good way of explaining it? Or is it a useful way?
I think it's more almost inverted in that it's a situation in which adding in the structure of a clock would be useful rather than a situation that arises outside of a clock, outside of the influence of a clock. That's sort of like how I'd feel it is. The way I'd sort of approach clocks in general, and the way I sort of do it in my games, is that Usually it's more tracking progression of something that is prior established or will be happening, in the sense that you're sneaking into a base, say, and every time you're failing at some sort of way to get past the defenses and such, a counter will rise, and that is a counter leading up to some sort of event happening. Every time there's a narrative significant way where you're drawing attention to yourself, the clock that is the guards notice you and do something about it is rising. But in that sort of situation, I'd either already have a clock that going that was things that are happening to inspire a coup, and then I just count this event as one of those. But if this is the newest one, then yeah, I'd probably have to start a new clock. But yeah, it's a situation where either it is something where you're establishing a new clock just for the purposes of tracking it, or it's like the conclusion of some sort of other clock that was already pre-established in a sense.
Well, can you end up with a situation where you have too many clocks running and becomes a bit too complex for you? I mean, after all, we have individual actions of characters, group actions, and then everything else.
I've seen some complicated clock layouts for Blades in the Dark, certainly, where there's like,
Yeah.
I think I've had a dozen running at one time. But as long as you name them and you're aware of what's happening, like one clock is, a certain gang that they've angered is coming after the party, and another is a different gang, and a third is like the police. And as long as you have it tagged and everyone's aware of where the story is moving, it's not super difficult. It just might be a little time consuming. And Blades is already a game that moves fairly quickly when you want to, so slowing down a little bit to handle kind of world stuff during downtime has never been a huge deal, for me at least.
And a lot of clocks are also fairly transient, where by the end of a session, they'll either have resolved or they'll no longer be relevant anyway.
Well, going back to Balance of Power, if we're to bring this sort of clock mechanic to it, it seems that at least the dark side, without doing many spoilers, has several clocks running at the same time, because you have different characters, you have at least two characters with, opposite goals or conflicting goals. And then you have, of course, the goals of the Empire itself. While at least so far, as we've seen on the Rebellion side, everything seems to be very much on the Rebellion clock. Up to a point, of course.
I mean, I don't want to go too in-depth in it, but the Rebellion side is definitely the weaker half of the show. They seem to spend all of their time fighting the monster of the week.
Yeah, well, more straightforward, I suppose. I think it's also different characterization of what they do. I mean, Jesse has really sort of taken the reins on the Imperial side.
I want to actually say Sam is definitely moving pieces in place. I think people probably are keeping their attention on Jesse, while Sam might actually be the Admiral Piet of the show, because he is in command.
Yeah. Is he? Is she?
I mean... Yeah. Do you really want to guess that the Force user looking into your brain might not be messing with you a little bit?
True, that's true. And let's go to another show. I think Mirror Shades also has very interesting. He didn't use Adam. I explicitly used clocks for that, but there was a lot of interpersonal conflict, as well as whatever mission or attempts at a mission the group was going on. And I think it would be very interesting to describe it as in clocks, right? Because you have the relationships, you have the goals of each of the characters, and then you have the intersection of those, those wants and needs. So would you, for example, ascribe a clock to each, or you say, okay, this is the party clock and this is the mission clock, and that's it?
I personally would have clocks all over, but most of the time I wouldn't make a lot of those clocks public because they're not particularly relevant yet. So it's usually more of a tool for organizing my own thoughts around a topic so that I'm more fair in how I integrate different aspects of the narrative into how things progress.
Yeah.
And I feel like, at least in Mirror Shade's case, it's not a terribly great example of it, just because so much of it was spent just dealing with like interpersonal issues and discussion. And so you wouldn't really be interacting with things that you'd be needing to track with a clock most of the time. It would be much more about what does this other PC do?
Yeah. Well, I think if Mirror Shades is not a great example, then I think Swan Son might be a better example. Especially because it does have a mechanic, like I said before, of the faction turn. And each faction has its own goals and ideas. And I invite everybody to watch or rewatch the faction turns for the show, because they're a very good way of sort of knowing the sort of the GM prep. At least the way Adam did it for that show was very interesting. And of course, each faction has their own thing. As new factions appeared, others were, removed. And also what the characters were doing, which was very difficult to predict, especially because JP was in the mix. So yeah, I mean, you always, that's the thing. Oh, that's an interesting thing. You always have a character like a JP, and JP is a good player, I would say, but someone who's always looking to shake things up and keep things interesting and move things along. Is that the kind of character that you would feel you want to would be problematic in a situation where you want to sort of keep track of the impact of the characters in the setting because they are so unpredictable, or seem to be unpredictable? That probably is a more accurate description of his actions. Or it's just something of like, well, players are players, and as long as the conversation keeps going, I got no problem with it.
I don't think it really matters. It's really more about tracking like what the end result of any actions that are done are. Like, even if you're relatively chaotic within session, the end result that you care about is actually, well, what material thing actually occurred in the fiction at the end of this all. And so like you can have a character like Night Sass, who is very, very crazy and chaotic, but at the end of the day, she's not dramatically changing the results of the mission in such a way that would impact any sort of faction advancement. Well, that's not.
Nope. I'm gonna say everything you just said is the exact opposite of true. Since she affected the meta fairly heavily, the introduction of Rainbow, the relationship with what's his name, the CEO guy, they got the entire mission in Tokyo off of that.
Yeah,
I mean, Night Sass affecting the meta as part of the session is literally the thing that she does.
I feel like Rainbow was purely on the narrative level, though, rather than...
She showed up a couple of times. More importantly, they got chased out of the state. They decided to go to Tokyo because their apartment got blown up by Rainbow fans. And the cops were looking for them. I mean, it's hard to get more both narratively and campaign focused than the one person who completely destroys your life and forces you to run to another country.
And we know what, for those who have watched the series, of course, if you haven't, again, you should. It was a big event, and the end result of it was very big. Also very interesting because the way that whole situation was resolved, in any other situation, it would have been an end to the campaign situation, right? It would have been such a, well, let's be honest, I'm going to use a bit harsh language. It would have been a bit of a clusterfuck. I mean, for me, a younger GM me would have just thrown his hand in the air, going like, what? How this? You guys? What? No.
I feel like that whole narrative section is probably when Adam gave up on running Shadowrun and started running Mirror Shades.
True, but see, that's, I think, Arthur always points this out as helpful as it is, that it's all about the fiction, it's all about the narrative, not only within the game, but between the players, and, talking to each other. And I think the good communication between the players, we don't get to see that, of course, but we can see the results on screen, was very good, was good enough that it kept it going as long as it did. Because somebody else was going like, forget it. Hey, thanks for playing. Good night. We'll check out some other game, whatever. At least a less experienced GM, a younger me certainly would have done it. It's like, yeah, I'm done, right? But he was able to transition from that and introduce new complications based on the input from the players, on screen and off screen, and sort of reset it, right? And keep going. And it was those complications and then led to new adventures for them as well, and introduction of new characters, etc., etc. And he was able to introduce, for example, one of the most famous bad guys of the Shadowrun universe into the play, and do it fairly well, I think.
I feel like the thing that he sort of kept was the Shadowrun narrative structure, but I don't think he actually kept most of Shadowrun mechanically. I feel like he dramatically hacked Shadowrun from that point forward because he just sort of completely abandoned that traditional mission structure that you'd expect from Shadowrun.
Oh, I mean, he abandoned that after the first horribly Ryan mission, when it seemed clear that they cared more about spending time with each other and, I don't know, Maurice than, literally anyone else.
Yeah. I mean,
for the group.
It was a dramatic hack. I think it also helped a lot that they didn't. Was it really a hack, though? I feel like it is.
I don't really feel like any new mechanics were introduced overall. It's really that just the way they decided to spend their time was more hanging out and less, I'm Mr. Johnson. My face got burned off by this guy and I want you to kill him. It's not a mechanical thing. There's no actual hacking a part of the game. It's just where people wanted to put their time. And Adam went along with that.
Yeah, I felt it was a hack in that so much of the reward structure and advancement of Shadowrun is tied into a presumption of this sort of like mission by mission sort of situation that's going on. And so when you abandon that, you sort of have to dramatically reconsider how you're thinking about like advancement and progression within the system.
Yeah, I suppose it's an interesting point. Yeah, which I think brings us back to the melding of systems and narrative in the sense of if you don't have, because Shadowrun is very much goal orientated, very it has great meta. We talked about that in the last show, but the system itself is more focused on the sort of go to the mission, do this, get your money, go back. It's sort of a sci-fi version of kicking on the doors and taking the treasure. But in this case, of course, is done within the milieu of fantasy / cyberpunk. And in the case of Mirror Shades, because you have the focus on the interpersonal relationship, it's more of, I think Adam just simply said, you know what, we're not using these systems, so let's use what we already got and keep on going, right? Because he introduced very early on the kind of mechanics that he would continue to use afterwards, which are not part of the basic Shadowrun, because the Shadowrun system, at least first edition, rewards players for not actually succeeding in the mission, but actually being heroic. And the mechanics that Adam introduced focus more on interpersonal relationships and personal goals. And I think the players took a cue from that, and they went from there. You think about it, I mean, if you have personal goals, and for example, your personal goal is to be the leader of the group, your focus is going to be on establishing the leadership on the group, right? And trying to get the people to follow you. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to succeed or fail on this particular, quest or not, or mission as it may be. And if that's an acceptable goal, then that is acceptable for the player to focus on that and have the fiction being steered in that direction. Thoughts?
I feel like that was definitely an influence for how Mirror Shades went, but I don't think it was really the driving force. I think that was purely just a result of the players. I feel like it ended up like reinforcing the players maybe, but I don't think that was really a reason they went the way it did. I think a decent example of that might be old school adventures where they ran Keep on the Borderlands, where they were in a lot of ways fighting that system because so much of what they wanted to do was much more character focused and like narrative focused, when really that is something that Moldvay D&D does not support or is like structured around.
And one could argue that Molde D&D doesn't have any rules for the sort of strategic side, which is ironic because if you look at Keep on the Borderlands, it does have that idea of you going into the borderland, right? Going into, like Kingmaker, going to an unexplored place, expand, and build up on it, at least thematically, for the description of the place. But when you get down to it, it's just a matter of going to in the case of chaos and kicking ass. Although, bringing back the clocks idea, the fact that you have within the Cave of Chaos, or people haven't played the module, you should, it's a classic, in any version you play it in, you do have different factions, and each one of those factions have limited, but still have their own worldview and their own, takes on things, and defeating or altering one faction is supposed to have a ripple effect on the other factions. So, and in a limited sense, the system itself, Molvays or most of D&D doesn't support that, but the adventure kind of does. At least it strongly suggests, for example, if you defeat the goblins, then the orcs might move into the territory. Or if you make an alliance with the orcs, then the kobolds or the hobgoblins might react in a certain way, right? So it does have a sense of, it's not simply a matter of finding the creatures and killing them. It's a matter of actions have consequences, which I think is ultimately what we're talking about when we talk about strategy versus, the tactical level, strategic level, is that tactical decisions, personal decisions, and narrative, or party decisions, in the smallest sense, have larger impact and consequences, or could immediately over time, on the meta, on the setting, on the larger narrative. You guys think that might be a way of seeing the Case of Chaos?
I feel like it somewhat is reinforcing what we're saying about a lot of this stuff being on like the campaign or GM layer, because so much of that being then in the adventure layer is sort of like the equivalent. It's just like a pre-made adventure instead of something that you have to construct with your players as your own game. Like, I don't think it's integrated necessarily into the core game, but then that's also a more complicated situation because so much of classic D&D then is the integration of all of these like different things as the core rule set rather than it being like a pre-packaged complete thing on its own.
I got a few episodes into Old School, but I never finished it. I have to say the Shadow is definitely my favorite character. Although I think the last one I watched, Dave was away, so we didn't get to see the Shadow there.
Yeah, the Shadow is... It's very interesting because Molde is one of the way it worked out was that none of these characters, essentially, they were just their stats.
I mean, yeah, and there were a bunch of terrible wizards who couldn't do anything.
Yeah, that's because if you're lucky, you can get Magic Missile in the first level. Or
they
sleep.
Mostly just got the ability to carry large amounts of cargo behind them, or...
Yeah, I kind of reverse of third edition, where basically the fighters usually became the magic item carriers. But yeah, so there's that. Yeah, but one of the interesting things about that and how things can evolve is that the characters themselves were just stats, right? Because they were disposable.
I'm gonna go in a different direction with this and that. I don't know the Moldvay rules. I never played first or second edition D&D. I don't know Caves of Chaos at all. But isn't this exactly like many earlier editions of D&D, especially third, have this problem where there is no social interaction mechanics, right? Like half the book is dedicated to combat stuff, feats, spells, different classes, and all of it is combat based rather than talking about social interaction. And yet so much of what I saw was social interaction. But it's a role-playing game, so I'm kind of not surprised, right? Maybe it was just the characters involved and their vision of what they wanted to do with the game. But I very much felt like the characters were characters. There was like an elven love thing going on. There was the shadow being the shadow. They may have started as stats, and some of them may have desperately wished to kill their characters. Like, what was the wizard's name? The one that John had. What was his name?
I don't remember.
He was just like, okay, guys, I'm very rich, and I want to join the party. Now, I'm going to walk in the front and see if I can get killed. And he just literally wouldn't die. He was alive forever. But yeah, even with their desperate attempts to kill this character off so that they could take all his money, he lived, and he got a personality and a character out of it. And wasn't that the point of D&D? Like, isn't that why they staged it down from wargaming to guys with swords going on adventures, right?
Yeah, but again, yes, that's true. But again, because I have played old D&D and I played multiple times at Caves of Chaos, the way that Adam did it was essentially that the characters were disposable. But what's interesting is that their personalities emerge from the gameplay. Like, this guy didn't die. We want him to die. He doesn't die, so he has a personality. Shadow. Oh, Shadow was a thief, but now he survived and he's smart, so we're rooting for the Shadow, and the Shadow gets to be more of that character, right? There's a priest. I don't know if you've seen that part where the priest is a priest of chaos.
Oh, no,
right?
I got that part.
But I
got to the part where they were representing their... There's no good and evil. There's only law language and chaos language. Oh, yeah. I got to that part. They were throwing down.
But that's also part. Yeah, that's part of the original Dungeons and Dragons system where there was no good and evil, and so their personalities emerge from what they were doing, right? And in essence, it's a reverse of what we're talking about. The setting, the adventures impacted on the characters, and in essence created the characters, because it was when people talk about classic adventures, like, oh, I survived this, so my character is known for surviving this or that or doing this great thing. That's, I think, mostly what happened. And also, I think you might think, well, the players themselves couldn't help but give personality to the characters, whether the characters had it enough, because the rules themselves just reduce the characters to numbers and abilities. But the way it was played by the group, it was inevitable that personalities and ideas would resolve from it. But I got the feeling that it really was more of this happened, and because this happened, then we have the impact on the characters.
I feel like you're helping make my point. In that it's not the system that they chose to play that was important, but the people who were playing it chose to play it in a specific way, which was
very much
to imbue personality and interaction between these folks. And, when they went to town, they tried to get away with some stuff, and to some extent it didn't really work.
That's something that evolved out of D&D over time, and Gygax was notoriously sort of against, because that wasn't sort of how he had intended the game to be structured.
Yeah, but Gygax had a giant table for words that meant slut, so...
Yeah.
The less said, the better.
Yeah. Which is ironic, because also, when I first started thinking about this and thinking about D&D, is like D&D, for example, has, at least first and second edition, for example, had rules for henchmen, rules for followers, rules for building a keep or a castle, whatever. So there were some rules there, minimal and complex, depending on how many books you had available to you, of strongholds or characters, whatever, especially in the Splat book era. But there were rules that said that yes, your character is going not only to grow, power wise, again, items and levels and hit points, but they're also going to have an impact on the world. But the problem was that the tendency was that the moment the characters really started having an impact, it was time to retire the characters. Like, oh, now you're the Duke of this land. Well, there's no modules, there's no stuff to support this. If you're running the game the way we think you should be running it, this guy just becomes an NPC. Roll up a new character. Let's go back to the dungeon, right? They tried to solve that with Birthright, but I think the problem with Birthright was it was too top heavy. It was too much on the strategy sense, making decisions about moving armies and making deals, and the dungeon delving was more like, well, you just happen to be D&D characters, so might as well go to a dungeon once in a while and kill something, And while fun, the strategy side of it was, it was very complicated. Like it was too much on the other side. Oh, we don't have rules for this. Now we're gonna have an entire campaign that's gonna deal with this. And it was like, okay, thanks, I guess. So it can go too far in the other direction as well. But that's just my experience with Birthright and everything else. Yeah, Arthur, come on. I'm beginning to read that face of yours. You have an idea. Yeah, come on, just give it.
I mean, I never played Birthright, so I can't comment on this. Mm-hmm. And really, I'm just gonna sit in my corner and and talk about players and GMs, and they're gonna play how they want to play.
Yeah. What is he freaking out about?
Anyway. Yes. Having mechanics in place to support a particular style of play can be important, especially if you are getting introduced to games. That's why I suggest people play Apocalypse World and, to some extent, Dungeon World and a dozen other games. Like Downfall is amazing. Microscope as well, at showing people how to make worlds together. And it's probably great not just for GMs, but also just for what we would consider regular players to just go and play that sometime and be like, yeah, I'd love to do this in my D&D campaign, and then realize you can do that. Just got to talk about it.
I'm more of a strong proponent of play a game that does what you're wanting it to. And so, while you can do almost all of these things in all of these settings, it's much easier if you go into it with a system that supports the thing you're wanting to do from the start, rather than putting that responsibility on your GM and players to sort of create that layer.
To one that already has mechanics for it and encourages that kind of play, as opposed to having sort of fight the system.
I mean,
sometimes it's fighting the system. Often
is it though? Isn't the point of all role-playing games to allow you to explore your imagination and put you in these situations? And you have to provide some impetus there, no matter what game you're playing, right? When you generate a character, you put something into that character and change the world as a result. Whether it's as simple as I exist, or as complicated as I'm the Duke of Umpteenthville, and here is the full stat page for every person in Umpteenthville because this is Burning Wheel and I own them. They're my peasants. To some extent, being part of the world is changing it, and you're presenting to the GM and your fellow players, like, this is me, this is who I am. You need to, you can't just go around it and be like, I've never heard, you could be like, I've never heard of Umpteenthville, but you can't be like, Umpteenthville doesn't exist and neither do you. I deny its existence. It's there, it's a thing, and to some extent, they can choose whether to interact with that or not. Like, someone could be like, my father was killed by the Duke of Umpteenthville, and I'm searching for him, and wow, what an amazing backstory having those two party members are.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could work. Yeah, certainly.
So
it's more a question of what level of narrative interaction you're wanting support for.
Sure. I will accept that answer rather than drive further in.
So it is possible in some games. To recap, some games do not only allow it, but they encourage it. Others, well, they leave it up to the players, and including the GM, by the way, to do as they think they can do. And in some cases, like in the case of Mirror Shades, it's like, well, we're just gonna play a slightly different game, because why the hell not? It's what we like. It's what we want to play. So before we go, we're closing out to 10 minutes to the hour. I'd like to do some shout-outs. Start with Scaredium. You're going to tell us where we can find you on the interwebs.
You can find me pretty much anywhere at Scaredium, primarily on Twitter, where most of the time I just rant about science, in particular biotech.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitch, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook at AP Gaming Real. I run a lot of stuff. I watch a lot of stuff.
And of course, you can find me, Rafael Pinheiro, under Lessons Learned on YouTube, and one of these days, hopefully on Twitch as well, and as Rafa Writer on Twitter. And always a shout out to Adam Coble, the game master of the universe, who is the inspiration for the Mathsquad community, and of course the Mathsquad community podcast. You can find him under Skinny Ghost on Twitter and on Reddit, and as Adam Coble on YouTube and Twitch. So thank you very much for having us. If you are a regular watcher and or listener of the podcast, we are always welcome your comments and suggestions. So as always, if you like this or any show on my channel, please comment and subscribe, and we will see you when we see you. Goodbye.